The unseen armor. David Carter moved through the bustling terminal with a quiet confidence, almost blending into the fabric of the crowd, yet never fully part of it. The noise of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and announcements over the loudspeakers barely registered for him. His mind was already far ahead, calculating the movements of the day, navigating his surroundings with a practiced ease. It was a skill he had honed over years of travel, years of adapting, and years of learning the rules of spaces that were never truly built for someone like him. This wasn't just about catching a flight, it was about keeping his place in a world that often made him feel like he had to justify his very existence. David had learned the importance of being early, not out of a fear of missing his flight, but because it gave him control. It gave him the armor of invisibility, a moment where he could exist in the margins, where no one questioned him, or worse, assumed he didn't belong. He had perfected the art of moving through the world without drawing attention, without giving anyone a reason to look twice. Dressed in a sharp navy suit with an almost imperceptible crease on the sleeve, and his well-worn leather carry-on suitcase rolling behind him, David looked every bit the seasoned traveler. His shoes, polished to a reflective shine, clicked rhythmically on the terminal floor, each step measured, each movement purposeful. But there was something more in the way he carried himself, a certain set to his jaw, a quiet tension in his shoulders, that told the story of the battles he had fought and the ones yet to come. David didn't fit the typical image of a first-class passenger. He knew that. He had seen the look, the momentary pause in someone's eyes when they saw him in a space that, on the surface, didn't seem to belong to him. The hesitance, the judgment that flickered too quickly across a face before it was masked by politeness. He was used to it by now. He had learned to navigate it, just like he learned to navigate the formalities of ticket counters and check-ins. It wasn't a new experience, it was just another reminder of the invisible walls he would always face. As he approached the gate, he could see the flight attendant standing near the podium, scanning boarding passes and welcoming passengers with well-rehearsed smiles. One of them, a woman with neatly cut short curls and an overly practiced demeanor, stood slightly apart from the others. She caught sight of David as he neared the front of the line. There it was, the brief hesitation in her gaze. He could feel it. It wasn't a casual glance, it was a quick scan, a decision being made in her mind. Was he lost? Was he really meant to be here? David had learned long ago not to react to that first glance, not to acknowledge the quiet questioning that seemed to follow him wherever he went. But today, it felt different. There was a strange weight in the air, an undercurrent of expectation that set his senses on edge. He approached the counter, and the attendant looked at him, her smile just a little too bright, a little too knowing. "Good morning, sir. Can I see your boarding pass?" "Certainly," David said, handing her the pass with a practiced smoothness. He knew the drill, had gone through this countless times before. There was no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. His first-class ticket was in order, the seat he had reserved was his, and all the necessary paperwork had been checked. He wasn't a novice traveler, this was a routine, one that he had done with ease hundreds of times before. But as the attendant scanned his pass, her eyes flicked back up to meet his, lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. She looked at him again, as though double-checking something. The smile she had greeted him with faded ever so slightly, replaced by a more cautious expression. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone polite but firm. "I'm afraid there seems to be an issue with your seat." David's stomach tightened, but he kept his face neutral. "What kind of issue?" he asked, his voice calm, though he could feel the unease creeping up inside him. "It appears that your seat assignment is incorrect," she said, glancing down at his boarding pass again, then looking up at him. "You're booked in economy, not first class." David's heart skipped a beat. He had checked his reservation. He had paid for first class. His flight was confirmed. There was no mistake. The confirmation email, the seat selection, the payment, it had all been done. But the way the attendant was looking at him now, almost as if he were a problem to be solved, told a different story. This wasn't just about a mistake. This was something else. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," David said, trying to keep his voice level. "I paid for a first-class seat, and I was confirmed for this flight." The attendant's eyes narrowed just a little. It was subtle, but David caught it. Her expression shifted from one of concern to something colder, more impersonal. "I'm going to need to check with my supervisor," she said, a thin layer of irritation now creeping into her voice. She handed his boarding pass back to him with a practiced gesture, but there was no warmth in it. As she walked off to consult with a colleague, David could feel the weight of the moment settling in around him. The terminal seemed quieter, the bustling noise of the crowd muted, as if the scene were slowly narrowing down to just him and the attendant. A sense of déjà vu washed over him, but this time, something felt different. There was an unspoken tension in the air, something familiar, yet far more insidious than he had anticipated. He knew what this was. He had been here before, though it was usually in a different form. It wasn't about the seat. It never had been. It was about the assumption that someone like him didn't belong in spaces like this. It was about the power dynamics, the way society had been built to expect certain people in certain places and not others. And today, for some reason, it felt like the world was reminding him of that fact once again. David took a deep breath, steadying himself. He couldn't afford to lose his composure, not now. He knew the game. He knew the rules and the unspoken dynamics of power and authority that governed spaces like this. He had played along with them for years, staying in the shadows, staying quiet, waiting for the inevitable moment when someone would question his presence. But today, this was different. Today, he wasn't going to stand down. Carolyn returned a few moments later, flanked by a man who was introduced as her supervisor. He was tall, sharply dressed, with a look of authority that seemed calculated and deliberate. His cold gaze swept over David without a hint of recognition, as if he were a problem to be solved, rather than a person with rights and dignity. "There seems to be some confusion," the supervisor said smoothly, his tone practiced and calm. "We've checked your reservation, and it appears that you've been assigned to the wrong section." David could feel the indignation rising inside him, but he suppressed it, willing himself to stay calm. He had paid for first class. He had followed the rules. But none of that seemed to matter now. "I assure you," David said, his voice low and steady, "I was booked in first class, and I expect to be seated in that section. If there's a problem with your system, then it's on your end, not mine." The supervisor gave him a look, as though weighing his words carefully. But instead of apologizing or acknowledging the mistake, he nodded to Carolyn, who turned toward the back of the terminal, presumably to call for further assistance. David's mind raced. The situation had just escalated. What started as a simple seating issue was quickly turning into a battleground of sorts, an unspoken standoff between the system and one man who had simply asked for what he was due. This wasn't about a seat. It was about something deeper, something more dangerous. It was about challenging the very notion of who was allowed to occupy space and who wasn't. As Carolyn walked off to retrieve someone from security, David's thoughts flashed back to his many years of dealing with the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, reminders that the world had certain expectations of him. Expectations based on the color of his skin, his economic status, his very existence. He had seen these looks before. The disbelief. The suspicion. The assumption that he didn't belong in spaces where others like him were rarely seen. But today, David wasn't going to back down. Today, he was going to remind them that he had just as much right to occupy that first-class seat as anyone else. He was ready for the battle that was about to unfold. The quiet battle. The minutes felt like hours as David stood there, his mind swirling with the weight of what was happening. Every step the flight attendants took, every glance exchanged between the supervisor and Carolyn, heightened the sense of unease that had settled over the terminal. The usual noise of the airport, announcements echoing over loudspeakers, the murmur of passing conversations, the shuffle of travelers, felt distant, muffled, as if the world had paused around this one singular moment. A moment that, unbeknownst to most, was already shaping up to be something more than just a flight dispute. David's calm exterior was a careful construct. Beneath the surface, his pulse quickened, not with fear, but with something else, an anger so cold and precise it was almost clinical. He had been here before, facing systems that didn't want him in the spaces he had every right to occupy, but never quite like this. This time, it wasn't just about prejudice veiled in polite gestures and well-meaning ignorance. This time, it was something far more calculated, far more dangerous. The flight attendant, Carolyn, returned to the counter, her gaze fixed firmly ahead as though she were trying to avoid eye contact with David. Behind her, a security officer, tall and imposing, followed closely. His presence was all too telling, his posture was rigid, his uniform freshly pressed, as though he had been prepared for this moment, for this confrontation. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to come with us," the supervisor said, his voice steady and detached, almost rehearsed. His words held no apology, no empathy. It wasn't an invitation, it was an order, and it hung in the air like a heavy shackle. David's mind raced for a moment, but he stayed rooted in place, refusing to let their calculated attempt to push him out of his rightful space succeed. He had seen this before in countless ways, his presence questioned, his dignity undermined, his rights disregarded. This was just another tactic, another attempt to undermine him, to make him feel small, invisible. But he wouldn't let it happen again. "I'm not going anywhere," David replied, his voice steady, but filled with an unwavering determination. "I've paid for this seat, and I have every right to be here." The security officer's eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to gauge how much of a problem David would be. The supervisor, who had been standing a few paces behind Carolyn, took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. "You're causing a disturbance, sir," he said, his tone condescending. "We're simply trying to resolve this issue, but your behavior isn't making things easier." David's eyes locked onto his, the sharpness of his gaze belying the calmness of his voice. He could feel the other passengers beginning to take notice. Some had stopped talking, some had turned their heads slightly, but all of them were watching, some with curiosity, some with judgment, and some, no doubt, with a quiet sense of discomfort at what was unfolding. David could feel the weight of their eyes. But he also knew that this moment wasn't just about him, it was about something far larger. It was about the way systems like this often sought to silence those who dared to challenge them, those who were willing to stand up for their rights, even when it seemed like doing so would make them an outsider. "I'm not disturbing anyone," David said, his voice calm but firm. "What you're doing is the disturbance. You're questioning my right to be here, and I won't allow it." The supervisor's eyes flickered momentarily with surprise, as though he hadn't anticipated this kind of resistance. Carolyn shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation now that it had escalated so quickly. She glanced toward the security officer, who remained impassive, his arms folded across his chest. David could feel the tension building. This wasn't just about his seat anymore. It was about asserting his place in a world that often didn't want him to take up space, to stand his ground. It was about refusing to let someone else dictate his worth based on assumptions and biases that had no basis in reality. For a moment, the scene seemed to freeze. The passengers around them had fallen into an uneasy silence. The noise of the terminal, the constant hum of conversation and movement, had dissipated as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next move in this quiet battle. David's mind flashed back to the years of subtle, everyday moments, those instances when he had been treated differently because of his skin, because of his presence in places where he was supposed to be invisible. It wasn't just about this one flight. It was about the years of experiences that had shaped him, the countless times he had walked into a room and felt the quiet judgment of others, the times he had been asked questions he shouldn't have had to answer, simply because of the color of his skin. But David wasn't just anyone. He had learned long ago that the world might try to box him in, might try to impose its own limitations on him, but he would never accept those confines. He was a man who had worked hard for every inch of his success, who had earned his place in the world, even if the world wasn't always willing to recognize it. He wasn't about to let a simple matter of a seat assignment become the latest effort to strip him of his dignity. "I don't think you understand," David said, his voice carrying just a little more weight now. "I'm not here to make a scene. But I'm not leaving this gate. I've paid for a first-class seat, and I will be seated in that first-class cabin." The supervisor's face tightened. His calm exterior, the mask of professional detachment he had so carefully cultivated, faltered for a moment, revealing a flicker of frustration. He glanced toward Carolyn, who quickly stepped forward, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. "We'll take care of this," she said, her voice more authoritative now, though tinged with nervousness. "Please follow us, and we'll resolve the issue." David shook his head. "I'm not following anyone," he said, his voice now cold and unwavering. "You'll either let me board this flight, or we'll continue this conversation. But I'm not going anywhere." The security officer took a step forward, his hand hovering near his radio, as though preparing for an escalation. But before he could make a move, there was a sudden shift in the atmosphere, a shift that was almost imperceptible but enough to change the entire dynamic. A new voice broke through the tension. A man, mid-30s, sharply dressed in a black suit, approached from the side. His walk was purposeful, confident, yet he exuded an air of authority that wasn't based on intimidation, but on something else entirely. As he neared the group, he made eye contact with David, then with the supervisor, his expression unreadable. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low but commanding. The supervisor hesitated for a moment, then straightened his back. "Sir, there's been an issue with this passenger's seating assignment. He's been asked to move to the economy section." David's eyes shifted from the supervisor to the new arrival. There was something different about this man. He wasn't wearing a uniform or a name tag, but there was an undeniable authority in the way he carried himself. His presence was enough to make the supervisor pause, even falter for a moment. The man didn't acknowledge the supervisor's explanation right away. Instead, his gaze turned to David, as though taking his measure. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, but David didn't look away. He wasn't about to back down now. Finally, the man spoke. "I've just spoken with corporate," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "And I understand there's been a mistake. Mr. Carter, I'm sorry for the confusion. You're confirmed in first class. I'll have this corrected immediately." The supervisor and Carolyn both looked at him in shock, as if they couldn't quite believe what they were hearing. The security officer, too, remained still, his hand frozen by his side, unsure of how to proceed now that corporate had intervened. David allowed himself a moment to process the shift in the situation, to let the weight of the unexpected resolution settle in. But his mind was already far ahead, his thoughts moving toward the next steps. This wasn't just about one man's seat, this was about an entire system, one that could not be allowed to silence, to overlook, to dismiss. David nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the man. "Thank you," he said, his voice calm, though the storm inside him was far from over. He had won this round, but the real battle was yet to come. The hidden struggle. The atmosphere in the terminal had shifted once more, this time subtly, yet undeniably. The tension that had previously filled the air seemed to dissipate almost immediately when the corporate representative stepped forward to intervene. His words, calm and authoritative, were enough to put an end to the immediate conflict, but David knew this was just the beginning. He had been through this kind of thing too many times before, the uncomfortable moments, the quiet questioning, the refusal to accept that he belonged. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the corporate representative, whom David now recognized as a senior manager from the airline, turned toward the supervisor and Carolyn. There was a brief flicker of surprise on their faces. It was a look that didn't escape David's notice, as if the sudden intervention had shifted the power dynamic in a way they hadn't anticipated. For all their carefully laid plans, for all their assumptions, it was clear that they hadn't expected anyone to stand firm against them, especially not someone like David. The corporate representative, a man in his early 40s with an air of quiet authority, didn't waste any time. He didn't even acknowledge the supervisor's attempt at an explanation, cutting him off with a brief motion of his hand. "I've reviewed the records," he said, his voice clear and unambiguous. Mr. Carter's seat was booked in first class, and this situation should never have escalated to this point. David, though grateful for the swift resolution, couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in Carolyn's demeanor. She looked frustrated, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as though she were bracing herself against something. Her eyes flicked toward David, and there was something in them that told him this wasn't over. Carolyn may have been willing to let the situation go now that corporate had stepped in, but David could sense that she wasn't done. She was far from the kind of person who would quietly accept being undermined. "Sir," Carolyn said, her voice tight with barely contained irritation, "this is an internal matter, and we've already taken steps to address it. We'll make sure your seating is corrected, and you can board as soon as possible." Her words, though polite on the surface, carried an edge of condescension, the kind that David had heard all too many times before. It was the same tone people used when they were trying to downplay a situation, trying to push someone back into their place without acknowledging the root of the problem. But David wasn't buying it. He wasn't about to let her off the hook so easily, not when he knew the deeper issues at play here. "No," David replied, his voice calm but firm, "this is not an internal matter. This is a systemic issue that has to be addressed, and I'm not going to let it go just because you say so." The corporate representative raised an eyebrow at David's response, a slight curve of amusement touching the corners of his lips. He seemed to be studying David closely now, perhaps impressed by his resolve, but there was something more in his eyes, something like recognition. It was a look that suggested the corporate representative understood exactly what had just transpired and the larger implications it carried. "I understand," the representative said, nodding slowly. "And I assure you, Mr. Carter, we will address this issue thoroughly. We'll be reviewing this entire situation with the airline's leadership to ensure it doesn't happen again." David looked at him for a long moment, silently processing the words. He didn't doubt that the airline would address the immediate issue, but the problem was much bigger than just this one encounter. It was about the subtle forms of discrimination, the assumptions that governed everyday interactions, the way people of color were often made to feel as though they didn't belong in certain spaces. And those issues didn't just disappear with a few apologies and reassurances. "I appreciate that," David said, his voice measured, "but this isn't just about me. This is about everyone who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong, like they have to fight for a place that is rightfully theirs. It's about the everyday racism that doesn't get talked about because it's so insidious, so ingrained, that people don't even recognize it when it happens." There was a long pause, and David could see the corporate representative's expression shift slightly. He seemed to take David's words seriously, a small shift of understanding dawning in his eyes. For a brief moment, David wondered if anyone had ever said it quite like that to him before. In the corporate world, where appearances were everything, people were often careful about how they acknowledged uncomfortable truths. But there was something different in this moment, something raw, something genuine that made David feel, if only for a brief instant, that his voice had truly been heard. But as the representative took a step back, David couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The supervisor and Carolyn had already begun to retreat into the background, their faces tight with discomfort, but that discomfort wasn't just from having been called out, it was the unease of people who had been challenged, who had been forced to confront the very biases they had so easily taken for granted. David's thoughts were interrupted as a new voice cut through the tension. A woman, older, with a calm yet commanding presence, had entered the scene. She was dressed in a professional suit, her hair neatly pulled back into a low bun. Her eyes flicked briefly over the group, assessing the situation with a calmness that suggested she had been through countless similar encounters before. "I'm Emma Harding," the woman said, offering a small but genuine smile to David. "I'm the regional director for customer relations. I've been made aware of this situation, and I want to personally apologize for the way it was handled." David studied her carefully, trying to gauge her sincerity. He could see the effort she was making to come across as approachable, professional, but there was something more in her gaze, a depth of experience, perhaps, that suggested she had seen the same patterns of discrimination that had brought him to this point. "I appreciate your apology," David said, meeting her gaze with a steady resolve. "But this goes beyond just a personal apology. This is about creating a culture where people like me, people who pay for their seats and follow the rules, don't have to constantly prove that we belong." Emma nodded, her expression softening. "I understand," she said, her voice gentle but resolute. "And I want you to know that we're committed to addressing these issues at every level of our organization. This will be reviewed and taken seriously, and I will personally ensure that the steps we take go beyond surface-level solutions. We want to make sure that every passenger feels valued and respected, regardless of who they are." David wasn't sure whether he believed her. Corporate promises had a way of ringing hollow when they came too easily, when they weren't backed up by genuine change. But there was something in her tone, something in the way she didn't shy away from the difficult conversation, that made him wonder if this time, it might be different. "I hope so," David replied. "But you'll have to show me, not just tell me." The moment hung in the air for a few beats longer before Emma turned to address Carolyn and the supervisor. "I'll be taking over from here," she said, her tone brokering no argument. "Please make sure Mr. Carter's seat is properly assigned, and that any further issues are handled appropriately. I'll be closely monitoring the situation." With that, she turned back to David, offering him a reassuring smile. "I will ensure that you are taken care of. Please, take a seat in the lounge, and we'll get this all sorted out." David nodded, his gaze still lingering on Emma as she turned her attention back to the staff, her authority unmistakable. He could feel the weight of the moment slowly lifting, but there was still a gnawing sensation in the pit of his stomach. The system had bent in this instance, but he knew it wasn't going to be an easy fight. There would be more battles ahead, more obstacles to overcome. This was just the first step, the beginning of a much larger struggle. As he made his way to the lounge, his thoughts were a jumble of conflicting emotions. Part of him felt victorious, knowing that he had stood his ground and made a statement about what was right. But part of him also felt a quiet exhaustion. A weariness that came from constantly fighting against forces that didn't want him to succeed, forces that wanted to keep him in a box. But David was a man who had never backed down from a challenge. He wasn't about to start now. The battle was far from over, and he was ready for whatever came next. Unseen forces. David sat quietly in the lounge, his eyes scanning the terminal through the large windows, though his mind was far from the bustling activity outside. The events of the last hour replayed in his mind, each moment a sharp flash of tension, but he refused to let the exhaustion take hold. He was used to this fight, the quiet, simmering battle against systems that seemed designed to hold him down. What had happened today, what had unfolded in front of him, wasn't new. But the stakes felt higher this time. There was a gnawing sensation at the back of his mind, an uneasy feeling that lingered despite the resolution that had been offered. David's thoughts drifted to the corporate representative, Emma Harding, and the other staff members he had interacted with. Their faces seemed sincere, but he knew better than to trust smooth words and well-practiced apologies. He had learned, over the years, that these gestures, however polite or well-meaning, were often little more than a facade. And Emma, as genuine as she seemed, was part of the same system that had allowed this situation to unfold in the first place. No matter how much she promised change, he knew it would take more than one conversation to dismantle the ingrained biases and prejudices that governed so many interactions in the world of corporate America. David leaned back in his seat, the soft hum of the lounge's environment offering a strange sense of calm. He had dealt with this kind of thing countless times before, being dismissed, being questioned, being told he didn't belong. Whether it was in the workplace, at airports, or in other public spaces, he had learned to navigate the discomfort, the judgment, and the exclusion that was often directed at him because of the color of his skin. But today, something about this encounter felt different. It wasn't just about him. It was about something larger, something that had been building for years, something that had finally reached a boiling point. His mind returned to the flight attendant, Carolyn. Her actions hadn't been random. There was a deliberate intent behind the way she had questioned his seating assignment. Her discomfort wasn't merely about an honest mistake, it was about a deeper, more ingrained sense of entitlement, of assuming that someone like David didn't belong in first class. It wasn't about a seat, it was about who was allowed to take that seat. David knew that systems of power were often much subtler than outright hostility. Carolyn's behavior, though less overt than what one might expect from someone intentionally discriminatory, spoke volumes about the assumptions that ran unchecked behind the scenes. It was the kind of quiet, insidious prejudice that often went unnoticed by the people who weren't directly affected by it, but for those like David, it was a constant presence, a weight they had to carry with every step they took. The more David thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about Carolyn or the airline, it was a reflection of a much larger societal issue. One that spanned industries, institutions, and everyday life. The uncomfortable truth was that the world was structured in ways that allowed people to be marginalized without ever overtly acknowledging it. The systems that governed public spaces, like airlines, weren't built to accommodate people who didn't fit the mold, who didn't look or behave in ways that were deemed acceptable. And as much as society might like to believe it had moved past such outdated notions, the truth was far from that. David glanced around the lounge, noting the casual conversations, the soft clicks of people's keyboards as they worked or browsed their phones. It all seemed so normal, so ordinary. But inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that the very ordinariness of the moment was part of the problem. People went about their lives unaware of the quiet injustices happening around them, unable to see the barriers that were constantly put up for people like him. Barriers that were often invisible to those who had never had to face them. And when those barriers were confronted, when someone like David dared to speak up, the response wasn't always one of understanding or solidarity, it was often one of defensiveness, dismissal, or worse, outright hostility. The quiet hum of the airport lounge was suddenly interrupted as the door swung open. Emma Harding entered, her face as calm and composed as ever, though there was something more in her eyes now, something that suggested she understood the weight of what had just occurred. She paused when she saw David, her gaze softening for a moment, as though she had something more to say than the usual corporate pleasantries. "Mr. Carter," Emma began, her tone polite but serious, "I've spoken with the airline's leadership team, and I wanted to follow up personally on our earlier conversation." David sat up slightly, sensing the gravity in her voice. He had half expected this, but it still felt like a punch to the gut, the idea that the conversation wasn't over, that it was only just beginning. "I appreciate you taking the time to address this," David said, his voice steady but guarded. "But I'm not sure that speaking with leadership is enough. This is a systemic issue, and if you want real change, it has to come from the top down, not just words." Emma nodded, as though she had been expecting the response. "I agree. And that's why I wanted to let you know that this is being treated as more than just an isolated incident. We are reevaluating the way we train our staff, the way we handle customer interactions, and the unconscious biases that have likely influenced the way our employees handle certain situations." David raised an eyebrow, the skepticism evident in his expression. He had heard promises like this before, countless times. "Unconscious bias training," he said, his voice tinged with doubt. That's usually a quick fix, isn't it? Something they tell you to do to make it seem like change is happening, but it doesn't actually change anything. Emma's eyes flickered with a brief flash of understanding, and she took a seat across from David. She didn't immediately respond, as if weighing her words carefully. When she did speak, it was with a quiet intensity that made David sit up straighter. "You're right," she said, her voice measured. "Unconscious bias training isn't a catch-all solution. It's a start, but it's not enough. We're planning to overhaul the entire approach to diversity and inclusion across the board, something that goes beyond just training. We'll be looking at hiring practices, internal policies, and even customer feedback to create a more inclusive environment for everyone, no matter their background." David listened closely, his brow furrowing as he processed her words. The skepticism was still there, but there was a glimmer of hope as well. Could it be different this time? Could this be the beginning of something real? "I want to believe you," David said, his voice quiet, but firm. "But actions speak louder than words. You're right that training isn't enough. What I need to see is a commitment to real change. Change that goes beyond a one-time fix and becomes part of the fabric of how you do business. It's not just about making sure that people like me get to sit in first class, it's about making sure we feel welcome there, and that we aren't treated differently just because of the color of our skin." Emma met his gaze directly, her expression unwavering. "I understand," she said, her voice tinged with a sincerity that made David pause. "And I can assure you that this will not be swept under the rug. We are committed to seeing this through. It will take time, but we will work to change the way we operate, internally and externally. This is just the beginning, Mr. Carter." David nodded, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. It wasn't the answer he had expected, nor was it a promise that everything would change overnight. But there was something different in Emma's words, something that gave him a sense of cautious optimism. He had seen the patterns of deflection before, the empty promises, but this time felt different. Maybe it was because Emma was willing to confront the discomfort head-on. Maybe it was because, for the first time, someone in a position of power had listened to him, not just heard him, but truly understood the deeper issue at play. Still, David wasn't about to let his guard down. He knew that true change required sustained effort, and that wasn't something that happened overnight. But perhaps, just perhaps, this was a sign that the winds were shifting. That the system, though stubborn, was beginning to acknowledge the need for real transformation. And if that was true, then David Carter would be right there at the forefront, pushing, questioning, and demanding that the world finally meet him on his terms. A shift in the winds. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty, though they were laced with a strange sense of hope. David had experienced the hollow promises before, the corporate letters, the brief apologies, the vague reassurances from leadership that never truly translated into action. But there was something about the conversation with Emma Harding that felt different. Her words were more than just corporate speak, there was a weight to them, an intentionality that David hadn't seen in many of the conversations he'd had over the years. It was the beginning of something, but how far would it go? How long would it take for real change to trickle down into the practices that had long upheld the status quo? David's mind wandered back to the incident as he prepared for his flight home. The lingering sting of the confrontation with Carolyn still hadn't fully dissipated, though he was doing his best to move forward. But the reality of being a black man in spaces that were rarely made for him had always been part of his life. The world was quick to offer advice on how to move forward, how to rise above, how to be better, how to play the game, but what no one seemed to talk about was the emotional toll it took, the constant weight of trying to belong in spaces that weren't meant for you. He had been through enough of these moments to know how they played out, the initial confrontation, the apology, and then the return to business as usual. The cycle was predictable, even if it hurt every time. What David had seen today was different, but only time would tell whether Emma and the airline were serious about truly dismantling the systems that perpetuated discrimination. David walked toward the boarding gate, his carry-on bag in tow. There was a steady hum of activity around him, the usual pre-flight chaos, families gathering at the gates, people lost in their phones, staff calling for final boarding. The terminal was bustling, but David's mind remained elsewhere. The day's events had made him question how deep the work to change the system truly ran. He had been part of too many conversations that never led to tangible results, too many instances where the most meaningful actions were swept aside under the guise of doing the right thing. He had arrived early as always, walking with that familiar air of quiet resolve, knowing that being early wasn't just about punctuality, it was a way to prepare for the scrutiny that often followed. When he handed over his boarding pass at the gate, the attendant looked at it with an appraising glance. Her gaze lingered on his name, though she quickly looked away, perhaps thinking he hadn't noticed. David didn't give her a second glance. It wasn't the first time he had seen someone pause, unsure of whether a man like him really belonged in first class. He was used to it by now. But that didn't mean it didn't sting, and it didn't mean that he could afford to forget the undercurrents of what was happening. David found his seat in the first-class cabin, the aisle stretching before him like a quiet reminder of the invisible barriers that existed, despite the luxury surrounding him. He settled into his seat, adjusting the armrest and placing his bag overhead. It was just another day, another flight. He had been in this position countless times before, and yet the weight of the moment still lingered. Despite everything that had happened, despite the promises of change, he couldn't shake the feeling that the system would always find a way to resist. As he glanced around, his eyes met those of a woman sitting across the aisle. She was older, wearing a neat business suit, with an air of quiet confidence that reminded him of Emma Harding. The woman smiled faintly at him, a smile that seemed to acknowledge something unspoken, a silent recognition of the struggle that had unfolded earlier that day. David nodded politely, offering a small smile in return, though his thoughts were still distant. He couldn't help but wonder, was she aware of what had happened? Did she see what he saw? The seatbelt sign dinged as the plane began its ascent into the sky, and David leaned back in his seat, letting the quiet hum of the engines soothe his nerves. But his mind remained alert, aware of the unspoken dynamics around him. This was the part of the journey where he allowed himself to reflect, where the chaos of the world outside could be briefly shut out. Yet, today, the questions and doubts continued to swirl. The airline had promised change, but would it be enough? Emma had said the right things, she had acknowledged the flaws in the system and pledged to address them. But David had been around long enough to know that change was slow, and even the most well-meaning organizations were often too entrenched in their practices to make real strides. And so, the weight of the question hung in his mind: was this an opportunity for meaningful progress, or was it just another temporary solution to an age-old problem? He looked out the window, watching the clouds float by as the city below faded into the distance. There was a strange peace in the moment, but it was bittersweet. He had spent so much of his life fighting for the simple dignity of being seen, of not having to justify his existence in spaces that were meant to be open to everyone. But every time he made strides, every time he fought for change, it felt as though he was pushing against an invisible wall that never quite budged. But then again, David had never been the type to give up. He had spent years pushing back against systems that seemed designed to exclude him, but with each fight, he had grown stronger, more determined, more resilient. Maybe the winds were changing, slowly but surely. Maybe there was a possibility that things could be different. Not just for him, but for others who had been silenced by the weight of history. As the flight continued, David allowed himself a moment of clarity. This wasn't just about one incident, one confrontation, or one airline. This was about the larger struggle, the one that stretched across generations, the fight for equality and justice that so many before him had taken up. Every step forward, no matter how small, mattered. Every time someone like him spoke out, it created ripples, forcing the systems that governed their lives to acknowledge the flaws that had been so carefully hidden. When the plane eventually began its descent toward the destination, David felt a sense of resolve settle within him. The fight was far from over, and he knew that the path ahead would be long. But that wasn't something he was afraid of. For as long as he had breath in his lungs, he would continue to challenge the systems that sought to hold him down. He would continue to demand better, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or unworthy. The world had a way of resisting change, but David had learned that resistance was a necessary part of progress. It was only through challenging the norms, questioning the structures, and standing firm in the face of adversity that real change could take root. And though the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, David Carter was ready for whatever came next. He was no longer just fighting for a seat on a plane, he was fighting for the right to exist fully, to be recognized, to belong. As the plane touched down, David stood and retrieved his bag from the overhead compartment. The passengers around him moved with the same hurried pace, but his steps were steady, each one a reminder that the fight was far from over. The quiet battlefield might shift, but the struggle for justice and equality was a fight worth every ounce of energy he had left. And so, as David walked down the aisle toward the exit, he felt something stir within him, a quiet certainty that this was only the beginning of something far larger. A moment of reckoning. David stood in the small airport terminal, the bright fluorescent lights buzzing above his head as he waited for his bags. The journey had been long, both physically and emotionally, but it wasn't over yet. Despite the smooth landing in the well-behaved cabin, there was a lingering tension that refused to dissipate. He had been through many flights, many airports, many awkward moments, but the one that had happened just a few days ago remained fresh in his mind. The quiet tension he had felt in that first-class seat, the way the staff had eyed him as if he didn't belong there, hadn't left him. It wasn't just about a mistake over a seat assignment, it was about something far more insidious, a reality that was difficult to ignore. David had heard the promises from the airline. He had heard Emma Harding, the corporate representative, speak with conviction about change, about addressing systemic biases, and about making sure that the incident would be handled properly. Her assurances were as polished as her appearance, her words wrapped in the right amount of empathy and professionalism. But he couldn't shake the lingering doubt. Words were easy. Promises were easy. What was harder was the quiet work that needed to be done behind the scenes, the uncomfortable conversations, the dismantling of deeply ingrained prejudices, and the reshaping of cultures that had been built on exclusion and inequality. As he picked up his bag from the carousel, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from his sister, Shauna. The message was brief but pointed. "You okay? Heard what happened on the flight. Proud of you for speaking up." David smiled as he read the message, but the smile was bittersweet. His sister had always been his rock, the one person who truly understood the weight of his experiences. But in her words, he also sensed the shared exhaustion, the exhaustion that came from fighting battles that often seemed endless. How many times had they both found themselves in situations where they had to speak up, to push back, to demand the bare minimum of respect and dignity? Too many to count. David quickly typed back, "I'm okay. Just tired, you know. It's like we're always fighting this fight, over and over." He paused for a moment before adding, "But I'll keep going. For all of us." Shauna's response came swiftly, a simple but powerful message, "You're not alone. I've got your back, always." As David slipped his phone back into his pocket, he felt a moment of clarity. He wasn't alone. He never had been. And as much as the battle sometimes felt like a solitary one, it wasn't. Every conversation, every protest, every moment of resistance, it was all part of a larger movement, a movement that spanned generations. The fight for equality and justice was never just about one individual, no matter how personal it felt at times. It was about the collective strength of a community that had been marginalized, oppressed, and silenced for too long. David walked through the terminal, his thoughts swirling. He hadn't asked for this fight, no one did. No one asked to be thrust into the spotlight, to have their actions scrutinized, to have their worth questioned by people who believed that their space in the world was somehow more justified. But David had come to realize that when you were forced into that position, you had two choices. You could either accept the lie that you didn't belong, or you could stand up, speak out, and demand your rightful place. It wasn't always easy. In fact, it was rarely easy. But it was always necessary. As he made his way toward the exit, his thoughts turned to Carolyn, the flight attendant. He wondered what had happened to her in the days after the incident. Had she been reprimanded? Had she learned anything from the encounter? David didn't wish harm on anyone, but the truth was that her actions weren't just an isolated mistake, they were indicative of a broader, more systemic issue. Carolyn had acted out of discomfort, out of a deep-seated assumption that someone like David didn't belong in first class. She had believed that her power, her role as an authority figure, gave her the right to question him in a way that no one else would have been questioned. And that was a reflection of the biases that ran deeper than one individual's actions. But Carolyn wasn't the only one. She was a product of a system that had been built to reinforce these biases, systemic barriers that existed in the world of corporate America, in the very fabric of society. It wasn't just about one person's prejudice, it was about a structure that allowed that prejudice to flourish, unchecked, for years. And while David had no illusions about the possibility of immediate change, he knew that it was the people who fought back, who spoke up, who made noise, who eventually created that shift. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a voice over the PA system, announcing the arrival of the shuttle that would take him to the parking lot. David made his way toward the shuttle, his footsteps purposeful. He wasn't sure where the road would lead next, but one thing was certain, he wasn't stopping. There would be other flights, other encounters, other moments when he would need to stand his ground. But he was ready. And as long as there were systems in place that tried to diminish his presence, he would continue to push back. As David climbed aboard the shuttle, he felt a sense of resolve settle within him. He was tired, yes, but he was also more determined than ever. The weight of the fight was heavy, but it was a weight he had carried for a long time, and it no longer felt quite as burdensome. He had learned how to navigate it, how to push through it, and how to find moments of peace amidst the chaos. The shuttle rumbled to life, and as it made its way through the parking lot, David allowed himself a moment to reflect on the road ahead. The change he had hoped for, was it possible? He wasn't sure, but he knew that the fight was far from over. People like Carolyn weren't going away, and neither was he. The system might resist, might push back, but every step, every moment of defiance, made a difference. Change was slow, but it was inevitable. David had learned that much over the years. And then, as if on cue, his phone buzzed again. He checked the message, expecting it to be another note from his sister. Instead, it was from Emma Harding, the corporate representative from the airline. The message read, "I wanted to personally thank you for your patience during this time. We are implementing several changes to our customer service training, and I would love for you to be involved in a discussion group moving forward. Your experience matters, and we want to make sure it's heard." David paused, his fingers hovering over the screen. There was no guarantee that this would lead to the change he had hoped for, but it was a step forward. For the first time, he felt like his voice had made an impact, that it had been heard in a way that mattered. He quickly typed back, "I appreciate the opportunity. I'd be happy to contribute." As he sent the message, a small sense of peace settled within him. This wasn't the end of the journey, not by a long shot. But it was a sign that the fight, the push for equality, the demand for respect, was having an impact. Change was possible. It was slow, yes, but every battle fought, every voice raised, every story told, made the future a little bit brighter. David stepped off the shuttle and into the parking lot, the weight of the day finally beginning to lift. The path ahead was uncertain, but as long as he kept moving forward, he knew he wasn't walking it alone. There was a movement behind him, a force greater than any one person, stronger than any one moment. And as long as that movement existed, there was hope.